Hi, I'm Juliet Parker, the Director of ALNAP, the Learning Network for the Humanitarian Sector. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our Learning Curve event, Connecting, Not Conflating, a way forward for people-centered approaches. The focus on people-centered humanitarian action, though loosely defined, has become a promising force for reform. It's helped unify key reform agendas, localization, accountability to affected populations, and inclusion, under a shared vision of putting communities at the heart of humanitarian action. While this convergence presents important opportunities, it also carries risks if these agendas are combined in ways that dilute their distinct objectives. As funding cuts put pressure on the humanitarian system, there's a growing concern that these reforms will be merged as a cost-saving measure rather than a path to meaningful change. This event is a space to unpack these challenges and opportunities. Together, we will explore where these agendas align, where they create tensions, and how we can advance a truly people-centered approach without conflation. We're also trying something new today, structuring the event to encourage candid debate and dialogue while culminating in a collective call to action. Today's Learning Curve event will unfold in 3 key moments. First, we'll hear from the author of ALNAP's recent synthesis report, which brings together evidence across these reform agendas. Second, a live debate will bring together representatives from each reform agenda to explore their role in a changing humanitarian landscape. And finally, we'll move into a live problem-solving session where panelists, drawing on insights from the audience, will identify key actions and strategies to ensure that connections are strengthened without losing the unique value of each approach. We're delighted to have you here with us and looking forward to a very rich discussion.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this exciting event. My name is Alejandro, and I'm a research fellow at ALNAP, leading our work on system change and locally led humanitarian action. As Juliet mentioned, today's event is structured around 3 key moments, all exploring a central question. What does a truly people-centered humanitarian system look like? In particular, we're focusing on how to better connect rather than conflate distinct reform agendas. With the current context in the humanitarian and development sector, we felt it was both timely and necessary for this Learning Curve event to serve as a space where different voices and reform agendas can come together for an honest, nuanced, and open dialogue, one that helps chart a more collective way forward. In this first session, we'll be engaging with the author of ALNAP's recent evidence synthesis and best practice review on AAP, inclusion, and localization. This research was made possible thanks to the support and funding of FCDO as part of a broader partnership dedicated to advancing people-centered humanitarian action. I'm delighted to introduce Veronique Barbelet, an independent consultant with over 15 years of experience in the humanitarian and peace sector. Many of you will already be familiar with her influential work in humanitarian policy analysis. She was the driving force behind this report. To start, Vero, could you please tell us what are the main takeaways from looking at the state of the evidence?
Great. Thank you so much, Alejandro, for this introduction. I would say there are 4 key main takeaways from this report. The first is that there are significant evidence gaps regarding what works for localization, AAP, and inclusion, especially in terms of how practices lead to better outcomes for people in crisis and how they make humanitarian action more effective and more efficient. This does not mean, and just let me be clear, that good practices or good recommendations on how to do things better don't exist. It just means that these are not very well evidenced. And these evidence gaps is a barrier to changing policy and practice, as they are felt to be very important to shift the mindset of certain donors and senior managers within the humanitarian sector. The second one, and is linked to that finding, is that the outcomes that we're looking for, so what is the change that we want to see, is not very well defined. In other words, it's not always clear how you would measure and what success looks like for localization, inclusion, and AAP, and very importantly, who is defining how that success looks like. And in the literature on localization, AAP, and inclusion, there is a constant call for these outcomes and what success looks like to start from people affected by crisis rather than from the top of the humanitarian hierarchy. The third one is that it's not always clear what evidence is needed to shift practice and policy and to shift the political will. So to convince donors, to convince senior humanitarian actors to shift their practices. And this is especially when evidence points to more disruptive practices that run counter to current interests. And it begs the question, is this constant call for evidence not a sign of a lack of political will? And finally, we see the increasing use of this umbrella term, people-centered humanitarian action. And this is not very well defined, and the terminology lacks clarity. It's not very clear what it means. But as you said, the report argues that there is a way of better connecting efforts towards localization, AAP, and inclusion that could be beneficial and help advance all of these agendas. However, and that's a big however, as you said in your introduction, there's a risk that these agendas become conflated and connect in a way that undermine their individual objectives.
Great, thank you, Edu. So a second question, which you actually touched upon in your last point, is we were doing a synthesis on people-centered humanitarian action. So how come that you decided to center it around these three different agendas, AAP, inclusion, and localization, if the core topic was people-centered humanitarian action?
So yes, indeed, this idea of people-centered humanitarian action is not a very clear concept, and it doesn't say much about what it entails. So some have defined it as moving towards more locally led, more inclusive, and more accountable humanitarian action. And in my own research, and maybe I've influenced a little bit of that movement, I have talked about that magic triangle of localization, AAP, and inclusion, as they are moving in similar directions and requiring tackling common challenges and barriers. So I see these three agendas emerging as really central to improving and reforming humanitarian action today. Why the use of this umbrella term is increasingly seen, I'm not sure. On the one hand, I think we all welcome this vision of putting people at the center of humanitarian action. On the other hand, as it is not well defined, it doesn't necessarily mean a lot. So are we talking about the leadership of local and national actors? Are we talking about more meaningful participation of communities? Are we talking about more accountability? And so there's this concern that putting these multiple agendas under this unclear umbrella term is driven more maybe by a desire to simplify, decomplexify, and mainstream away these issues rather than really wanting to achieve all the independent objectives.
Yes, and we saw from the report that, as you mentioned, there is this 3 chapters on each of the agendas, and it is focused on this umbrella sort of people-centered humanitarian action. But there's this very interesting chapter towards the end, looking at the interlinkages between the agendas and actually some of the tensions and how might they actually come together. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more why that was a focus and why it felt important to not just look at each of these buckets, but also look at how the buckets interact with one another.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm glad you found it interesting. I think it's really interesting to see how these come together, and there are many reasons for why you would want to look at their connection. So the first one is because the success of one depends on the success of the other. So for instance, one of the practices we found for inclusion is the role that local and national organizations run by and for marginalized groups can support more inclusive outcomes in humanitarian responses. But for these organizations to have the right funding, for them to have the right leadership space to influence the response, you need to tackle the localization agenda. So in a way, if you want to have more inclusive outcomes, you also need to tackle localization. So success of one depends on the success of the other. The second one is that we found that the increase in reform initiatives and cross-cutting issues tend to overwhelm humanitarian responders, and they are bombarded by multiple guidance, increasing number of requirements. And so considering common actions and more coherent guidance across the three could support more effective integration of these practices in humanitarian responses and therefore lead to greater impact for people in crisis. The third one, I've alluded to it already, is that these three agendas face common challenges and barriers. So why not think of addressing these so that they equally serve the three agendas? And then the other one is that all these agendas are concerned with shifting power. They're concerned about power relation, whether that's between international actors and local actors, whether that's between aid actors and communities, or whether that's with population groups that tend to be more marginalized. And so this agenda around shifting power require a very similar change process. But they also can run counter to each other, and they do not necessarily guarantee one another. So localization can replicate lack of inclusion and the lack of accountability. Inclusion can be top-down and center international actors, and AAP can lack inclusion and local leadership. But there are challenges to connecting these three agendas together. First, it can make what is already a very complex process of reform much more complex. And the second is, without support to coordination, to understanding what requires common efforts and what requires distinct actions, connecting them could increase the feeling that these agendas are being undermined in their unique attributes and therefore create more competition and territoriality. So this calls for better understanding how they can be connecting and how they can't be, and that has to be driven by the right intentions around really achieving the unique attributes of each of the agendas.
Thank you, because I think that was a really interesting part of the report, looking at those both benefits but also possible tensions between the agendas. And I think it's going to be a core part of the conversation that we're having today, the live debate, the problem solving at the end. So thank you for that framing. However, before we move into that discussion, we need to acknowledge that a lot of this work and planning for this event and the report itself happened before all the changes that the sector has been experiencing for the last few months. And so it feels very appropriate, and it felt for us that the conversation was more relevant than ever, but it feels very appropriate to ask you to situate a bit the debate, this people-centered humanitarian action, the convergence and connection or potential conflation of different reform agendas in the current context, in what's currently happening in the humanitarian sector. So if you can just tell us a bit of your perspective and your vision on how the current context influences and affects what we're going to be talking about today.
Yes, I think people-centered humanitarian action and the use of that umbrella will serve different purposes depending on what's driving the use of the term. And I think in this current context of prioritization and cuts and humanitarian reset, you kind of have three scenarios that will play out. The first one is actually not people-centered, but organization-centered and self-serving. So that's one where the terminology of people-centered humanitarian action will be used by organizations that are self-serving, that are trying to survive the current context. And so these organizations will talk the talk, but not walk the walk. They pay lip service to the language used by some donors, but not really wanting to achieve the objectives. And I think we see a little bit of that happening, for example, with pressures from the US administrations around taking away language that refers to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some organizations have really swiftly changed and removed that language from their website to address these concerns. And they could still be using this idea of people-centered humanitarian action, because the blurring of the lines that the umbrella term allows means that they can do maybe some localization but not inclusion. So I think that's one scenario. The second one is where people-centered humanitarian action is used for effectiveness and is as a drive towards more effectiveness. And there, I think the risk of this is that it will risk being used as a way again to simplify, to decomplexify, and mainstream away some of the unique attributes of these agendas. And will be done, some changes will be done that will drive effectiveness, but maybe not the type of change we want to see. And we see this a little bit in the localization literature, where some people talk of localization as the right thing to do and driving change that is deeper and more revolutionary, whereas others talk about localization as a means to an end to make humanitarian action more effective, where there is a risk that it doesn't quite drive the type of change we want to see. And then you have people centered as quality, where this is really about using that umbrella term and committing to it, driven by the desire to make outcomes for people in crisis better in the way that they define these outcomes themselves. And I think that's kind of the cherry on top of the cake, and that would be the best option, where we would see different organizations and individuals championing these agendas, coming together and really trying to push both on the commonality, but also keeping those distinctions alive and reaching the distinct and unique objectives as well as the common objectives.
Thank you for mapping those possible scenarios, and thank you for all the important and insightful reflections that you've provided, as well as the report itself. We hope that this report, and not just its findings, but especially the scenarios that you've outlined for the sector in the current context, help frame the rest of the discussion today. As we move forward, I am pleased to hand things over to Louis Sita, who will be moderating our next session, a live debate on people-centered reform agendas. Louis is the director of the Humanitarian Learning Center at the Institute of Development Studies. Many of you will already be familiar with his extensive experience in evaluation and policy review, as well as his recent work leading the independent review of OCHA's flagship initiative. Louis, over to you.
Thanks, Alejandro. Great pleasure to be here. So as Alejandro has said, I'm going to moderate this next session, and thank you for the introduction. So again, as Alejandro has said, we at IDS have been the learning partner for OCHA's flagship initiative, one of these reform agendas, aiming to look at people-centered approaches. And it has been interesting to see that there really are strong linkages between accountability, participation, and localization. Maybe less obviously inclusion, but with a bit of effort, that can become a really strong part of that magic triangle that Vero talked about. But I'm really excited to hear what our panelists have got to say about this and to launch into the debate. So we've got some great panelists. Dr. Puji Pujiano is a prominent Indonesian leader in humanitarian response, disaster risk management, and civil society advocacy. Extensive CV. He's served as the first Global South Sherpa for the Grand Bargain. He chairs NIR's Global Localization Lab, convenes the Asia Pacific Local Leaders Platform. He's played a key role in both ASEAN and Indonesia's disaster law and response frameworks. And he's currently the Indonesian National Association of Social Workers lead. Kirsten Lang is a program specialist in disability inclusive humanitarian action at UNICEF. Kirsten has been the co-chair of the Disability Reference Group since its establishment since 2020. It's a global mechanism for collaboration on disability inclusive humanitarian action. And then last but not least, Meg Sattler is the chief executive of Ground Truth Solutions, an organization that supports people affected by crisis to influence humanitarian programming and decision making. She's long been a voice on the need for more accountable and transparent aid, and has extensive experience on humanitarian accountability and community engagement with numerous UN organizations, agencies, communications for NGOs, and is a journalist by training. So can I ask you first, all three of you, to just reflect on this this topic of the three possibly connected, possibly at tension areas of inclusion, accountability, and gosh, there you go. I've already failed in my task as moderator. But I'm going to go straight to you, Meg, and then Kirsten, and then Pooji. So Meg, over to you.
Sure, thank you very much, and I hope you can all hear me. I mean, I assume that I've been brought here to talk about AAP, and I want to talk about accountability and not AAP, which is possibly breaking the rules. But I think it's because accountability is a much more simple concept than we sometimes make it seem. And if you think about the fact that the whole humanitarian machine has billions of dollars associated with it, and that there should probably be a basic assumption that those dollars are being used in the best possible way for the people who need to use them and that they're not hurting people. That's, to me, what accountability means. It's about the story that we should be able to tell about humanitarian assistance that we've sort of consistently failed to tell. To me, it's less of an agenda and more of an expectation. And so I guess if that exists alongside localization and inclusion in this magic triangle, I like that term from Vero, I think that's totally fine. The problem that I see is that it tends to exist with those two things in the rubbish bin. And I think that's going to become more and more pronounced at the moment as there's sort of this tension around less funding. I feel like sometimes when people talk about AAP and inclusion and localization, it feels like it's diminishing all of it. And I'm sure that that isn't the intention. Maybe it comes because someone says, these things are all nice and fluffy, and so we'll put them in the nice and fluffy box, and that will sort of sit alongside the real business of saving lives. Maybe that's because, as Vero said, we haven't done a very good job of showing evidence. I'm not sure. But I do think these agendas are really linked. I think, for example, the failure of progress on localization has made that accountability story much harder to so many people that we speak to as ground truth. Aid to its recipients seems really opaque. People don't know how to ask questions. They're not getting what they need. They're missing out. And when they're sort of quizzed on alternatives, very often the alternatives suggested are just more local leadership and more local initiatives to be supported. And on inclusion, I think there are very often calls for more local decision-making about things like targeting. There's a sense almost everywhere that we've ever worked that people who need aid the most are missing out on it. And at the community level, people share that aid around no matter what decision has been made. So I'm not necessarily an evangelist on AAP. I mean, show me most accountability frameworks and I could probably take or leave them. But I do believe that accountability is something that anyone receiving aid should be able to expect and demand. And if that can exist alongside other reform agendas that also sort of change power structures in humanitarian action, then I'm all for it.
I might just move us on to Dr. Pooji for the final opening thoughts on localization while we sort out some of the tech issues in the background. So thanks for staying with us. So Dr. Pooji.
Louis, thank you very much. Colleagues, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I would like to begin by extending my heartfelt greetings of Eid al-Fitr to the Muslim communities throughout the world. At the same time, also my deepest condolence and sympathy to colleagues, members, and partners of humanitarian organizations in Myanmar, where thousands of lives have lost, and the devastation continue because of the unavailability of access for humanitarian relief to reach Myanmar until today. With that in mind, allow me to start just touching a little bit on localization. Today, as localization agenda progressing, I might also like to note that the term localization has been used so liberally. It has been overused, reused, misused, abused, if you like, that attach so many meanings into it. But anyway, it's important to pin down of what localization, in my mind anyway. First, I thought localization as a concept to ensure that local communities and CSO leaders have the resources, agency, and support necessary to tackle their challenges. Number two, localization as a shift of power from the conventional power holder to actors who are closer to the ground. And the third meaning in my mind of localization is really a movement from the ground, if you like. My colleagues from the Global South organizing ourselves into a movement that taking some of the leadership, some of the role, like in Myanmar right now, ongoing. Our colleagues are standing up to respond to this on the ground, heading to the ground without the international community from the north or from the west necessarily. Now, that's being said though, the localization has many different state of play as well. It's not a monolithic thing, and I hope you agree with me. In the Middle East, for example, our labs, the so-called localization lab of the near network, are struggling with real issue of life and death, how to transfer resources to the ground. In the Americas, our colleagues are still struggling with power, with the power relation and what's not. In the African region, with the prolonging conflict, the issue of inequality are very, very thick on the ground. In Asia Pacific, we're looking at an Indo-Pacific that cannot neglect some progress in the Asian side, and yet we still have pocket of issues like Myanmar. Now, this being said, next that I would like to highlight is the people-centered agenda. Now, you and I have heard people-centered, people-oriented, people-led, what else? People-owned, many terms that goes with that. But I would like to see these three corners that was presented earlier as having a different edge that should be complementing. Localization is really talking about ensuring power, decision, and resources to be transferred to locals. The accountability, I suppose, is ensuring that the response are answerable to people they serve. And inclusion, really ensuring that all segments are involved actively and meaningfully. Now, I agree, it doesn't go as easy naturally. For example, when localization is emphasizing empowering local actors and community, it may have to challenge the accountability structure that are being exercised by the global north, for example. And then striving for inclusion necessitated engaging the diverse voices and ensuring that marginalized community are represented, potentially complicating efforts to standardize accountability across the board. And conversely, the demand for accountability from affected populations could entail very complex and stringent oversights that could stifle the localization. So I would say that how I see this three, when uncoordinated, right, could actually undermine one another, despite the fact that actually, in my mind, there are commonalities. The three of this agenda all are focusing on people. Number two, that we all seek empowerment. And number three, ultimately, we seek the improvement of the outcome. So in brief, Luis, what I'm saying is that I share what localization in my mind. I see how the three agenda could potentially undermine one another if we don't do anything about it. But I'm still hopeful that there are rooms for us to work together and bring forth the three of this as a combined power. Luis, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Puji. So great food for thought from both Meg and Puji, and not necessarily always upbeat. I want to bring Kirsten back in just very quickly for the introduction. I know that we're going to run a bit short of time, but Kirsten, we dropped quite a lot of you, so maybe just give us some headline thoughts and then we'll head into the debate.
Sure. Thanks, Lewis. And just checking if you can hear me better now. I've turned off my video.
Yeah, loud and clear. It's great now.
Yep, super. So, I mean, a lot of what I was going to cover has been addressed quite well by Pooji and Meg. So, as you mentioned, Lewis, I'll just be very, very brief. I wanted to build a little bit on Pooji's point that he just mentioned now around the potential risks of bringing these three agendas together in terms of potentially undermining each of them. So in working to bring these agendas closer together, we really need to be acutely aware that progress in one doesn't necessarily lead to progress in another. And that was really one of the key messages that I took from the report. And so for a practical example from inclusion, without a lens of inclusion, AAP and localization can actually serve to further marginalize certain population groups by giving that voice and agency to those who already hold power in communities, while further excluding those who don't. But with an inclusion lens, progress in each can be reinforced. So, for example, if we consider accessibility in the design of AAP mechanisms, we'll be better engaging with communities in all their diversity and therefore really have a fuller understanding of their needs and priorities. So indeed, there can and should be closer linkages between how these three agendas are addressed, both in policy and operational support, but there really does need to be approached mindfully and deliberately to avoid doing the exact opposite of what we intend. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. So I think we're now going to transition into the debate element amongst our panelists here, and you'll have to bear with us. This is slightly experimental on ALNAP's part, but Kirsten, maybe I'll ask you to follow on from that thought, and maybe you could ask Pooji some questions there about precisely what you just talked about, both the ability of localization to offer an opportunity for inclusion, but also perhaps the dangers inherent. Over to you, Kirsten.
Sure, thanks, Lewis. So Pooji, while challenges remain, we are seeing strong commitments and progress towards localization, as you've also spoken about. But local actors are diverse. So I'm interested to hear from you what you're seeing in terms of which local actors are being further left behind in these efforts, and what impact does this have on humanitarian response? I'm also interested to hear your reflections on what's needed to ensure that women-led organisations, older persons associations, organisations of persons with disabilities, and other local actors are all included in localisation efforts.
Thanks, Christine. I really like this new format of discussion. You're posing a question to me. But look, thanks. That's a great question. I think I have to start by acknowledging that, as I said earlier, despite the so-called progress on the part of localization, I must acknowledge and admit, Christine, that local actors do not benefit from localization equally. I would like to underline what you said, that women-led organizations of people with disabilities and other marginalized groups, refugee-led organizations, for example, may have not benefited directly and with the equal amount. I would say that not even localization will be able to pull them out of the mud, if that's the right terminology, of the issue that they have been so long and so badly experiencing. That being said, though, I think I have a slightly different perspective in saying that I think I would bet now, to be slightly controversial, that you could pursue accountability, you could pursue inclusion without necessarily bringing along localization. But I would say that it would be inconceivable to pursue localization without taking on board the accountability and inclusion. That being said, to address this cleavage that's still there, I feel that special effort need to be done, need to be exerted, special energy and resources to prioritize these special groups, the women-led organization, OPD and others. As I said earlier, the ordinary, even with extra effort on our part, will not be sufficient. We need to have an extra push on that. Number two, I think real investment need to be done, Kirsten, in terms of building the operational capabilities of our colleagues from these categories that need to be included in the game. And finally, I think it remains high in the agenda to foster a culture of inclusivity within humanitarian agencies. I think as many other language where usually it's taken for granted, now it's become a rubber stamp. It's just a check to accomplish before you do job. I think I have to agree with you. We need to make extra effort. We need to be a bit more diligent on this thing. Kirsten, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, PG. Maybe I will jump in because it's actually in this new format. It's your opportunity to ask Meg a question now. And I think, you both talked about the strong links between accountability and localization, but I think, PG, you talked about, the danger that potentially accountability could be used against local organizations as a way of of undermining power too. So, but I'll let you two talk about both benefit, the connections and contradictions.
Yeah, just to breathe the fire into conversation. Let me start. When I was much younger,
I'm ready.
When I was much younger, we would have a humanitarian operation, Luis, all in place, all resources put in place. And then somebody said, now let's talk about accountability, add one layer to that. And that addition increased the operation, scope and depth tremendously. I think you're right in saying that I would be rather suspicious that accountability from time to time tastes like the order from the donors imposed upon us. All right? It's a bureaucratic function that additional requirement, if you like. I would say that the situation of Myanmar, my conversation with colleague in Myanmar on the ground today, this morning, our colleagues do not have the luxury to even show themselves visibility in the open. Everybody is operating underground with local outfit and with zero visibility. Now, if we use the accountability in the normal sense, we cannot operate. Meg, I'm exaggerating the introduction. Essentially, the question is, how would you respond to the concern that accountability practices are sometimes seen as imposed upon us and potentially undermining our engagement? And secondly, how can we better join the localization and accountability agenda in the way that it would not penalize local organization? When I took a quid pro quo, I swallowed it. It feel like it's stuck on my throat, if you know what I mean. Okay. All right, I stop with the analogy. Over to you, Meg.
No, thank you so much. There's a lot in there, and I knew you would throw me some curveballs. I think on the first part of your question about, is this sort of something technical that's been imposed on people? I think it is, and I think sometimes it's worse than that. And I feel like, in my humble opinion, that's kind of the great shame of accountability to affected people, is that instead of sort of tackling these more fundamental questions of accountability in ways that make sense for communities, like the communities that you've just described in Myanmar, we sort of treat it like it's something to be added on to a status quo approach. So we say, we'll do the program and then we'll add accountability. And maybe that accountability will be a hotline, or it might be a series of mechanisms, or it might be a survey. But as you say, it is often something that is kind of feeling like it's imposed as a checkbox. We have so many examples from ground truth. There was one from the DRC in Congo where people have become so frustrated with feedback boxes that they not only sort of speak about them with venom, but in some cases they set them on fire. And in the Central African Republic, there's been this huge focus on response-wide accountability mechanisms, but it's a response that really sort of struggles to act on the feedback. there was a crazy example that I heard today of in Nigeria, there's an accountability and engagement working group. And then a sub-working group of that working group is the accountability to affected people working group. And I wouldn't say that's a response where the actual notion of accountability is taken all of that seriously. So I think it is a real risk. I think also these mechanisms, when they do feel imposed, can really undermine trust because people feel very disrespected at what is possibly the worst time already in their life. So I probably can't defend accountability against that accusation. I think that does happen because the way that we see accountability is very much about compliance and not so much about the sort of small a accountability. I think in terms of tackling that by joining up agendas, to your second question, I do think it's sort of problematic that we have certain frameworks in accountability that do feel very kind of global in nature. We just did some work in the Central African Republic, and many local organisations had sort of become so institutionalised on AAP that they said we can't do accountability unless we have more money, because we need to set up these mechanisms, and we've been told that we need to do all these things that came from the guidance from Geneva, instead of just using their superpower, which was proximity and talking to people and kind of knowing what people needed in their own communities. And so I think one thing that I see a lot of potential in, and it kind of touches on, I think, Pooji, what you were saying before about recognising better context and the role of different actors in society. I used to really love the work of Internews and partners like that who worked with local media, because what they did was they recognised in this community there are certain structures for accountability that already exist. And maybe we can support them in some way. And we're not going to tell them what to do, but we're going to recognise whether it's academia, civil society, media, they play a role in a sort of active society in a way that can be really enhanced by localisation. And so I think at this moment, there is probably huge potential for localisation gurus and people with an interest in accountability to join forces and push for change. But I definitely accept the fact that it hasn't been done probably in the best possible way up until now.
Thank you, Meg. So last interaction, it's your turn to ask Kirsten about inclusion. And to my mind, you know, the real accountability that you spoke of at the beginning seems to me intimately connected to inclusion, but clearly Kirsten warns us too that if you have majority rule, then minorities often find themselves excluded. So can you ask a probing question to Kirsten that will unlock some of those issues?
Yeah, I don't know how probing it is, but it's a question that's on my mind a lot, and I was really grateful for the opportunity to ask it because it comes up a lot in our work. And I guess the question is around this idea that inclusion is very closely tied to this concept of impartiality. And so often when we're having discussions with partners off the back of our data, inclusion of vulnerable groups is often flagged as sort of either a caution when it comes to localization. And I think you sort of often hear these anecdotes like, oh, but in XYZ community, the community leaders are corrupt, and so that's why people miss out on assistance. Or it's used as sort of a defense of international aid. Our data shows that humanitarian responses almost always fail to reach the most vulnerable, no matter what frameworks are being used. And so it sort of begs the question, when it comes to whether or not the most vulnerable are included, who gets to decide?
Great. Thanks, Meg, for the really great question. I think who gets to decide really strikes me as a question that we should be asking ourselves frequently, but we don't. We often talk about power dynamics between humanitarian actors and the communities they serve, but we also need to recognise the power dynamics existing within communities. And I think we shouldn't shy away from conversations about the impact that humanitarian response can have on these power dynamics. So as we all know very well, in any community, there are those who have access to decision-making power and those who do not. And the way that humanitarian response is designed and delivered then has the potential to either reinforce those patterns of exclusion or to find windows of opportunity to address them. So as you pointed out, Meg, it's often those who are most excluded from decision-making who actually have the most important insights into how to address vulnerabilities. And engaging with these most marginalised groups, it's long been a principle of community development, but it's one that we really struggle with a little bit more in the humanitarian space. In the context of complex emergencies, the need to act urgently with limited resources, we often turn to those established community leaders to speak for and to make decisions on behalf of affected populations, as you also pointed out. And this really further empowers those established leaders who already have existing power while maintaining the exclusion from decision-making processes that those more marginalised groups face. If we were to really prioritise the voices of those who are most marginalised and most severely impacted by humanitarian emergencies, and to transfer decision-making power not just from humanitarian actors to affected populations, but doing that in a way that also recognises the power dynamics within communities, humanitarian response does have the potential to transform those underlying factors that end up leading to some groups being more vulnerable and more at risk in emergencies. But the question I always get from my colleagues is, how do we do this in challenging emergency contexts where time is limited, knowledge of communities is limited? And this is really where the role of local organisations who represent these groups is key. So as Pooji's also spoken about, organisations such as those women-led organisations of persons with disabilities, youth networks, refugee associations, they have intimate knowledge of the patterns of exclusion in their communities. And these are the patterns that have placed them at greater risk in emergencies. They also have the connections to be better placed to meaningfully engage with their constituencies to ensure that these decision-making processes are inclusive. So for me, I really like your question because it's in thinking about a response to this question of who gets to decide that we really see those connections between AAP, localisation and inclusion become even clearer. But at the same time, I think in thinking about a response to this question, it also becomes clearer what are the risks of any one of these areas as we aim to bring them closer together. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. So a really rich set of reflections and challenges and ideas in a very short amount of time. Can I ask you, colleagues, just to give us one final minute each of closing thoughts, and then I'll wrap us up and take us into the next session, which is about trying to solve some of these problems that you've highlighted. So maybe Pooji, I'll ask you to go first, and then Meg, and then Kirsten, and then I'll conclude and we'll hand over.
Right. I guess looking into my context in Indonesia, I feel that inclusion and accountability came rather naturally. Example, case in point, during the pandemic, we have the queer, the transdresser, who live away from their homes, excluded from any government list, and they're completely out of the ledger. Our local organizations who have been working with sex workers and this group for a long time were part of our movement, part of the network and bring that case and that feel as if it is a natural. Let me contrast that with another thing in which humanitarian assistance come with an order that it must bring in LGBTQ agenda on board. Now, in a place like Indonesia, with 280 million Muslim people, where civil society is struggling and winning its space, bringing that rather unnatural compared to the first example would take incredible transaction cost. I guess what I'm saying, there must be a midway in which we can be held accountable to the requirements, but in a way that also that it will not wrangle down the larger agenda. So that I'm curious and keen to discuss with colleagues after this. Thank you, Luis.
Thanks, Pooji. Meg.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess it's hard to think about this topic outside the current situation that we're in with this massive funding crisis. And I sort of feel a bit inspired by Pooji's earlier remarks that this might bring everyone down to earth a bit. And I think that especially when it comes to localization and accountability, getting those two right, I think really challenges the humanitarian bubble. And that bubble is kind of bursting anyway. And I think one of the reasons why accountability feels so elusive is because the humanitarian sector tries to exist outside its contextual realities, and that makes it feel tokenistic. And so if this funding crisis sort of forces models that are more like solidarity with what communities actually want and prioritize, then it doesn't make sense to separate accountability frameworks so much from people's lives. And I think what that looks like is, for example, if you're having a conversation on accountability in DRC, you can't ignore the processes of resource extraction that are sort of robbing people of health and peace. And if you're having a conversation about AAP in Gaza, you can't ignore the need for accountability for Israel's blatant breaches of various international laws. And so I feel like this concept of solidarity where local leadership is respected and frameworks are sort of a bit more diverse actually has so much potential. And really just starts with listening to people. But I feel like that does challenge a lot of status quo approaches in the humanitarian system.
Very powerful. Thank you, Meg. Kirsten.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't have all that much to add. I think Pooji and Meg have really covered it well, but it's clear that in this current climate, we need to find efficiencies. We no longer have the option to consider these three agendas as completely distinct, with distinct sets of guidance, distinct coordination structures and technical expertise. So this current climate is really making it more urgent that we find ways to achieve these greater linkages that don't lead to a backsliding in progress and creation of risks for those who are already the most severely impacted by emergencies. I've been hearing a lot about this need for us to go back to basics. And I feel that what we've been talking about so far today, which is essentially ensuring that we reach those who are most impacted by emergencies with assistance that aligns with their needs and which fully recognises their agency, this is the basics. What we've essentially been talking about is impartiality and humanity, and it's therefore core to humanitarian action. But we can't simply decide that all these agendas, for example, will be addressed under the umbrella of one and expect that all of the basics will be covered, or to view technical expertise on each of these as being interchangeable. We've already started hearing today in the discussion around the risks that that kind of conflation brings. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next part of our session and to see what is the way forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks, colleagues. So I think, Meg, you started off by saying you fear that all three of these agendas have always been seen as peripheral to the urgent business of saving lives. And yet Pooji reminds us that today, in the awful destruction of Myanmar, it is the people locally who are doing all of the humanitarian work without our outside help. And that has always been the case throughout my humanitarian career. It is always our colleagues in the communities most affected who are hosting refugees and displaced people, who are doing the brilliant humanitarian response under the most challenging conditions. And it's those people who are most likely to be held accountable by their own communities as well because of that proximity. So I have always felt that these agendas are intimately connected. And I think the example, Pooji, that you gave us of LGBT people in Indonesia during COVID illustrates that too. Humanitarian work is all about the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, about our essence of humanity. And yet Kirsten reminds us that we have to work at that question, who gets to decide, and make sure that those voices are included. So colleagues, you've thrown up lots of challenges. You've shown us how these agendas are connected, but also the challenges inherent in trying to conflate them. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Anita to moderate the next session on potential solutions, or at least ideas. So Anita Katakuzi, probably many of you will know very well. She's the Director of Policy at NEAR. She has 14 years of experience in humanitarian action, in the past 8 years in humanitarian system reform and localization of aid policy and advocacy. She was at Oxfam for a decade before that, and has been involved in many of the big processes of the last few years, like Grand Bargain and the ISC. So Anita, over to you.
Thanks, Louis. Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us through this final session. I'm Anita Katakuzi. I am from NEAR, and I'm really glad to be facilitating this part of the session, the part that's focused on where we go from here and how do we move forward with purpose. So we've heard a lot about the 3 reform agendas: small a, accountability, as Meg has mentioned, inclusion and localization. I think everyone here knows that each of these reform agendas has its own history, its own advocates, but there's a lot that they share, not just in terms of values, but also what they're up against. And we just heard from the panelists, like, that is the reality right now. These agendas are facing real threats. We're seeing growing pressures on funding and a very scary political climate where civil society is shrinking and governments are starting to walk away from their equity and inclusion commitments. Some of this is very loud and overt, and others it's much more subtle, but the impact is the same. And I think these rollbacks don't just harm one agenda. If organizations are cutting ties with women-led groups or deprioritizing, healthcare to LGBTQ organization people or queer people, then it affects inclusion, it affects localization, it also affects how accountability is even possible. And that's why this session is important, because we can't actually afford to wait for donors or big agencies to connect the dots for us. We, in this virtual space, we really need to be the ones actively looking for those synergies, figuring out where we can work together without the risks, without flattening or diluting what matters. And yes, there are tensions for sure, but there's also shared purpose, as Pooji said so well. And if we don't find ways to stand together, we certainly all stand to lose. So we're going to open this session with a short framing from Veronique, who will introduce a lens-based approach as one way to think about how we do this better. And then we'll move into a discussion with our panelists. As we go, please do share your thoughts in this chat, examples of strategies or actions that have helped bring these reform agendas together in your work. And we'll try and pull a few of those into the conversations, as well as try and respond to some of the questions that have come through the comments. Veronique, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anita. So yes, in the report that we published a few months ago, we propose to take a lens-based approach to connecting these 3 agendas effectively. And these are kind of principles of how you drive decisions and actions. So what the lens-based approach means is, instead of thinking just about localization, AAP, and inclusion as distinct silos, the lens-based approach proposes to think of each agenda adopting the other two agenda as lenses. So in effect, not just localization, but inclusive, accountable, and participatory localization, not just AAP, but inclusive and locally led AAP, not just inclusion, but accountable, participatory, and locally led inclusion. And reflecting on what our panelists were talking about, I think it's just important to remember that when it comes to localization, there are certain challenges that local and national actors face. And evidence shows that these are 10 times for organizations that represent certain marginalized group. So LGBTQI organizations of people with disabilities, women's rights, women's rights organizations. So the questions, if you want to have an inclusive, accountable, participatory localization, is to really think, are we supporting locally led action that replicates the inequality and disconnect between responder and people affected by crisis? Are we supporting locally led action that replicates discrimination, marginalization, and pushing behind certain population groups? So really thinking through that. I think there were a couple of really good examples given by the panelists, one of which I had actually on my notes in the Central African Republic with the role of local networks of journalists and local radio as being great local accountability systems that, again, require that kind of space for local civil society, but also have a very important role to play in accountability. And the other example I wanted to bring around more inclusive AAP was in Northeast Nigeria, where Clear Global, which is maybe more known to you as Translator Without Borders, provided support to the response to ensure that all AAP system, two-way communications, needs assessments were inclusive of people of minority languages and minority language speakers. So these are some of the practical ways to think of when we're thinking about how to include those lenses to each of the different efforts and agendas. Over to you, Anita.
Thanks, Vero. That was, super useful framing. Make sure to read the report. You can understand it in much more detail as well there. So now I'd like to open this back up, bring back our panelists, Meg, Kirsten, Puji, and to help us unpack how we actually move forward. And just a reminder, we're keeping an eye on your comments in the chat, and I'll be trying to pull some of those into the in as we go. So please keep them coming. We're going to start broad, panelists, my esteemed panelists. First up, let's just talk broadly about connection and what strategies do you see are really important to bring the agenda together in meaningful ways without blurring them into one generic reform agenda, without seeing the tensions and the distinctions? Maybe drawing from your experience, like, what have you seen that actually works? We'll start there. Puji, I see your mic is off. Do you want us to kick us off?
Yeah, maybe just very, very quickly. I would like to start with underlining that at least on the part of NEAR network, where I'm the chair of the Global Localization Lab, we feel like it's already, as I said earlier, it's already intuitive that localization in our language brings already into it a package that it brings accountability and inclusion. So I guess what from our side, what we need to do is really bring forth the one that perhaps it was implicit to become more explicit, right? I don't see any major change or shift on the part of our framework at least. Let me stop there first. Thank you. Over to you.
But Puji, before you go, let me. We have a question from Silva Ferretti, which is a bit of a challenge to that, which is, we've heard these debates over and over. There are a lot of things happening in the world today. Doesn't it feel like we need to shift gears? Doesn't it mean that we need to do something differently?
If you give me all the freedom, I would like to go back actually. When I was younger, much younger then, I used to be working in a context where we just did humanitarian action. We just open up the space and protect and so on. But it was many, many decades ago. Things get very sophisticated now, convoluted at the same time. So in a way, it's inevitable. The changing gear that I'm seeing in front of me now is that instead of pursuing individual agenda, we need to pull it together. I think that's the changing gear. So in a way that when I am engaging with my local colleagues, I will not be meeting them 3 times on 3 different agenda. I would like to sit in one sitting. We talk about this in one go. Now that responsibility fall upon our colleagues outside of my system to tell me in my next meeting, what is it that I need to talk to my colleagues and bring it to me on my table. I'm going to wrap it up and present to them in one go.
Thanks,
That,
Puji.
and my way of shifting the gear. Thank you.
Meg or Kirsten, do you want to come in next, please? Yeah, Meg.
Yeah, I mean, just to reflect on that, I think to sort of zoom out a little bit, because I agree, we're sort of at this crossroads moment where I think there's a lot of anxiety because the sector could either sort of turn around and become the worst version of itself, or we have the opportunity to say, why don't we just listen to people about what they want and stop letting things be defined in Geneva or New York or London or donor capitals? Stop doing extractive assessments and let people just define priorities. And of course, that won't be perfect, but based on all the research that we have done, I would bet good money that progress on these 3 agendas would follow that. And you can sort of see that at a small scale when you look at mutual aid initiatives in really tough places like Sudan, like Gaza, like Myanmar. There's generally some sort of accountability system that is community defined, realistic, makes sense, very imperfect, but so are all of them. And so I think the challenge for this kind of reset moment is simply just to what extent do we listen? Because I think if we do, what we will see and what is sort of challenging for a lot of the system as it exists will be calls for investment in institutions, in civil society. I think everyone will be sort of pushing for ways that they can pull themselves out of crisis and not just stay in them forever. And I think that really challenges things like mandates, it challenges funding systems. And so, I don't know, I mean, I guess in a sort of dream scenario, if there's been this big funding shock, I don't think I'm ready yet to talk about that as being a positive thing because we're seeing every day the impacts of that, particularly in places like Sudan, but hopefully a more diverse system of funding that is more focused on solidarity might be able to fast track a way out of this sort of shamefully slow localization progress. And maybe it's an efficiency argument that does that. But I do really think that that might pull some of these other agendas sort of up a bit more. And we can finally say, to Vero's very first point, that there's no evidence. Here is more evidence at scale that this does actually mean a more conducive system of community solidarity. I don't know if that's a pipe dream, but that's kind of where my head is at the moment.
Thanks. I'm going to throw in another question, actually, to move us along. And Kirsten, please do come in. That they, for this part, if you want, there's a hard question actually from Melissa Pitoti, which is people-centered responses are led by people, many of whom are getting caught in the crossfire, losing their jobs, feeling increasingly stressed and distressed. Can you say more about Lewis's so-called magic triangle from a humanitarian perspective, and people who want to show solidarity during difficult times? Kirsten, maybe we can start with you. Others, feel free to jump right in.
Sure. No, thanks, Anita. I mean, I think it's a really great question from Melissa, and I'd actually just like to come in for a moment on another question around shifting gears, because I thought that was a really important question as well. And I wanted to build a bit again on what Pooji was saying around, do we really need to shift gears? In my view, I think we know what is needed on inclusion, localization, and AAP, but we just haven't seen enough progress in any of those three areas up until now. So I think what I'd really like to see in terms of a shifting of gears is a real recognition that these agendas are the core of humanitarian action. And if we're looking at having a reset, having a reimagination of how we work, seeing some opportunities, as Meg was alluding to as well, I'd really like to see us hopefully seeing how these areas of work can be brought more to the core of what we do, rather than being relegated, as they often are, to a nice to have, to an optional. So as we're doing some more serious thinking around prioritization, that we really shift our thinking to having these areas be truly at the core of how we work. And very concretely, in terms of a shift, it's very, very concrete, but I think we just need to have those who are working on these three areas working together more closely. As a very practical example, within UNICEF, we have a technical level working group where we bring together AAP, localization, inclusion, centrality of protection colleagues, and we develop joint approaches to how we support countries on these areas of work, rather than all coming separately with our pieces of guidance and training. But really interested to hear others' thoughts also on the question of solidarity. Thanks.
And workforce. Yeah, please, Pooji, you've come off. Thanks, Kirsten.
Yeah, maybe just adding to what Kirsten was saying. One other element, looking back into my own journey, has been there is nothing worse than having those additive given on the last moment during crisis. All right, that stifle the whole thing and undermine. So if we're serious about this, one, we need to bring these pieces early in the conversation during normal and peacetime. Number two, I support what Meg was saying. We need to reframe accountability. That this is not just upward accountability, follow the money. It is accountability 360, right? But in a way that is digestible, workable by local people. That's why it need to have time to ferment itself, to germinate locally, right? We need to be patient to come up with a more efficient system when it's needed. And number three, to have a good mix and trust the local colleagues to mix it. Just tell us what is it that you want at the end. Don't meddle too much, because that will hamstring our imagination, right? So those are additional things that I hope would strengthen what Kirsten was saying earlier. I need to offer to you.
Thanks. Meg, actually, maybe you might be able to talk about this workforce question also.
Yeah, I can try. I think it's such a good question, because I guess where you are in the workforce is very determined by your positionality at the moment. And I think we're kind of at this moment in history where our humanity is being challenged daily in a way that I think a lot of us haven't experienced before. And I think that's sometimes why, especially kind of career humanitarians or people who are maybe not as close to community level action, are feeling really lost. And I think it's because there's this disconnect between what is a humanitarian system and what is my role at the moment as a human being. And so, I don't want to get too warm and fuzzy, although I think Melissa would like it if I did, knowing her. I think as humans, all of us, no matter what role that we're kind of occupying, should think, if everyone in a crisis right now was in my family or was my elderly neighbour, what would I do and what would I want for them? And try and sort of use that as the starting point and move away from all of these frameworks that we've developed. And I have to say, and I don't know if this is kind of controversial, but Ground Truth works in a number of places, and one of the places that we work is in Ukraine. And every time we do some work in Ukraine, I look at what we find out and I just am really astounded by how much dignity is valued in that response in a way that honestly it isn't everywhere. And I feel like what I've learned from that is that when that is the starting point, when you really sort of respect every single person who's impacted by a crisis to say, this is what I need, and maybe it's something that the humanitarian system wouldn't have thought of, but it is a system that is going out of its way to support those things. Why don't we afford that to people everywhere? And if that is the starting point, I really do feel like these other agendas come together more naturally and they just sort of follow. So I don't know if I have a great answer to that question, but I do feel that it's kind of a moment for us all to look at ourselves as humans, at ourselves as humanitarians, and just say, what is something that I can contribute to our shared humanity at the moment? Because we're up against massive hate and fascism and people who really don't care if a large portion of the population doesn't exist anymore. And so I feel like, now is the moment that we do need to come together and say, okay, we have these different agendas and maybe they're not always aligned, but probably together there's a lot that we could do against a, big sort of common force that we're all working against at present.
Thanks. I'm going to throw, there's a lot of really good questions in the comments from the audience, but given the time, I'm going to kind of try and pull us a little bit back to the strategies and approaches, which was where we really wanted to focus this session. So there were two questions that came up that in the chat, in the comments, that were really about strategies and approaches. And so the first question to any panelists, do you think that the strategies look different at local, national, regional, global levels? So like what does it look like at the different levels? And then a second question is around the role of national governments, aid receiving national governments, and whether or not these reform agendas can succeed if we continue to rely on shrinking Western donor government funding. So I'm going to put those two to try and really consider responding in a way that draws out those strategies. Please, from your experience, what you've seen. Is that overwhelming? Too many hard questions at the same time? Panelists.
Peter, I can try and come in briefly on on the first question. Really great questions today. I think it's giving us so much really great food for thought, but I'm going to try and attempt that first question on the different approaches at country, regional and global level. And coming really down to the practical, I do think there are differences in how we approach this connecting, not converging at those different levels. I feel like at country level, it's where we're talking about how people themselves are experiencing the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So all of these points that Meg just very eloquently addressed around dignity and ensuring that we're meeting the needs that people themselves have. So I think it's really at country level where we need to see that much stronger connection between all of these issues. For somebody who is affected by a humanitarian emergency, they're not concerned about whether are you the person working on AAP or are you the person working on inclusion or on localization. That's not relevant. So I think it's really at country level where we need to much more strongly ensure that we're having this joined up integrated approach to the different agendas. However, I feel that it's at least at global level, if not at regional level, where we do need to maintain the technical expertise on 3 areas. There are some specific technical aspects where we need to be providing support to those delivering the response in country to ensure that they do have the resources to be able to reflect these three agendas. So I think it's at global level where we do need to maintain the specificities and do need to maintain the specific areas of focus, and at country level where there's probably more need and space to have greater coherence between the agendas. But I think what's key at all levels is, as I was mentioning before, bringing together the people, to be very practical, the people who are working on these different issues, and ensuring that they're not working in silos.
I can come in if helpful. I'm waiting for Pooji to come in, but I like the question because I think at the local level is probably where we could leverage the most common sense. I think that's where we just need to listen better to people. I think the national level is really interesting because to me, and I know that people will be laughing at me for this and saying there's no money and we need to save lives, and to some extent I get it, but I think this national level is where we really need to focus on systems and kind of look at, okay, from place to place, what are the different systems that constitute accountability? What are the different systems for inclusion that people are using? What role is the government playing? And can that be either sort of leveraged more, supported more, held more to account, whatever it is? I mean, this is different everywhere. At the global level, this is where I would maybe disagree with you a little bit, Kirsten, but it's from a very sort of blinkered accountability perspective. I sometimes think at global level we need to kind of learn more and advise less. And I only say that because I sort of see the implications of people rolling out different frameworks from a global level, even if they've been informed by a lot of different sort of country programs. And I think that's where a lot of this tension has come in, particularly around accountability, where people say, you know, like exactly like Pooji did, I don't want to be told to do something on top of everything else that I'm already doing in a way that doesn't necessarily make sense to me. So I feel like there's an element of letting go and learning at the global level that I think could be done a little bit better. And having that sort of global governance role focused a lot more around amplification, advocacy, trying to sort of direct funding where it needs to go against this backdrop of huge politicization, and maybe less kind of telling people what to do.
Maybe, Meg, just adding to what you said earlier, this is what happened in Indonesia. At the national level, we agree during the Humanitarian Congress in November. We do Humanitarian Congress every 2 years, huh? And we shape our own humanitarian framework in Indonesia according to our philosophy and way of living. This is great exercise, actually. And part of that, we agree that in Indonesia, humanitarian competence must be given to all NGO everywhere in Indonesia. It's like a swimming skill. It's your life-saving situation. It's a matter of when and how big disaster and crisis could happen, right? So everybody need to know about humanitarian. So what I was saying is that in that exercise is the ideal avenue where we can take all of these three agenda and bring it to the field. You know what I mean? And raise it up during the impending emergency and leverage it to become our conversation. That's one. Number two, I'm supportive of what you say, Mac. Colleagues at the global level need to hold their horses back a little bit. When I was younger in Geneva, I would have beer in front of the palais and talk among our colleagues and draw a little paper and send it to the field. And people in the field would look at that paper like Bible. They follow it to the dot. When I recall, my God, when I do that, I was drinking beer, you know, and talking about everything else. So, you know, matter of perspective. Now that I'm on the ground, I can appreciate what kind of things are falling off from the ceiling, and I would think twice before I'm riding on it. So those are my 2 cents addition to that. Anita, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. Hard questions. Thank you, audience, for your very good questions. You know, it's hard. It's hard to find the way forward. Well, it could be hard. It doesn't have to be. I think from the discussion, I do get the sense that there is, despite the distinctions, there is a sense of interconnectedness. The way we push forward will need to be context specific, very politically savvy, and different at different levels, also different with different actors. And yes, that means letting go for some, probably shifting incentives, expectations, our models of leadership. I think if I'm going to summarize in one word, some of what I heard, it's intention, acting with intention to connect our work, stand in solidarity when our different agendas are under threat, and to define how we move the next phase of reform together. With that, I'm going to close this session here and hand back to Alejandro. Thank you again for your thoughts and ideas in the comments, and yeah, please do read the report.
Thank you to all our speakers and moderators, as well as our audience. There was a lot of interesting debate and questions, and I know we were not able to get through all of them, but we will try to address them and get back to you on email. It was a truly engaging and thought-provoking discussion on the future of the sector, and particularly this people-centered humanitarian action. Your insights and contributions have made this a rich and meaningful exchange. I think today's conversation reaffirmed our research findings, and it's that while people-centered humanitarian approaches offer many benefits and opportunities, achieving truly transformative change requires us to recognize and navigate the nuances, differences, and tensions across different reform agendas. That's why we began with a live debate before moving into a collective problem solving. The complexity of the sector's ongoing challenges call for a proactive collective engagement across diverse perspectives to advance people-centered reforms. And honest and diverse spaces for learning, we believe, are essential for driving this conversation forward. With learning comes change, and now it's a time to listen, reflect, and learn from each other's experiences and challenges and unique perspectives as we propose and move towards, hopefully, a more transformative humanitarian future. We hope this event has contributed to this dialogue and to future collective action. Our research suggests that to better connect the three agendas, all actors should use a lens-based approach to understand intersections, address common reform challenges while acknowledging differences, and establish systems that reduce competition between different agendas. You can find our full report and summary pieces on our website. We've also shared the link on the chat. The summaries are available in Spanish, French, and Arabic. And if you have relevant resources to this topic, we'd love to hear from you, so please reach out. Before we close, I just want to do a quick note on feedback. Today, we were testing new elements to our learning curve format. You saw the live debate and a live problem-solving session. So please look out for an email with a survey link. We'd really appreciate your input so that we can refine and improve our approach on this learning curve new format. And finally, stay tuned for more upcoming events. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to stay connected. Thank you once again for being part of this important conversation. And we look forward to what's to come next.